Good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. We'll get started then. So test is on Wednesday, not tomorrow, but because of my schedule and a variety of other things, we are in the review session today, obviously. So we'll have another review session before the other big tests that we have, chapter 11 through 16, and then we'll also have one for the final. So you guys got your take-home essay on Friday, or Thursday maybe, right? Mm-hmm. I handed that out already. So if you did not receive that, there's more copies in the room. You can grab one when you come to school tomorrow. There's 4 different questions for that. You get to choose one of the 4. Like usual, all of them ask you to take a position, make a statement, like decide on a thesis and defend that. So be sure that you have, at minimum, an intro paragraph, a body, and a conclusion, okay? So other than that, the tests are all the same format, with the exception of the final. So it's 50 questions, matching in groups of 10, and then 50 multiple choice questions with 5 options. Generally speaking, since we have 5 chapters and there's 50 matching questions, they'd be 10 from each chapter, right? So those come from, I think all of them are in the book. There might be, yeah, they all are in the book, I'm pretty sure. There might be some that I didn't talk about in the notes, but they're all in the book, okay? So chapter 6 is on sexuality, chapter 7 is on deviance, chapter 8 is on stratification, chapter 9 is on global stratification, and then chapter 10 is on gender. So if you just kind of visualize and maybe you want to write down 10 terms that you think are going to be on there from the review pages or however you want to do that, I think that probably would help you, okay? So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the terms because I think those are pretty straightforward, just in terms of the sheer definitions of them, unless that comes up in some of that analysis that we're going to talk about later. So when I ask you about some of the application questions, I will ask you what some of the terms are for this review session here so you can get some ideas, okay? So let's think again. No, that's fine, no problem. So let's think again about the 3 main theories in sociology, right? What's one of the 3 main theories in sociology, Lucas?
SI.
Okay, SI theory, is that a micro or a macro level theory?
Micro.
That's a micro level theory, which means what, Spencer?
Focuses more on an individual or a smaller group and the symbols between them.
Yep, and how people make meaning out of exchanging those symbols, okay? So if you were to see an application question that asks you to identify what level of analysis is being used, which of the main theories is being used, regardless of the chapter, whether it's deviance, sexuality, stratification, you'd be able to differentiate between functionalism, conflict, and SI theory, okay? There's probably 4 or 5 questions that have to do with that, all right? So again, I said that's the first week of class. The hands down, the most important thing for you to understand is the 3 theories and be able to apply and identify when those are at play. There's probably 6 or 7 questions on the test that ask you to do that, okay? So we've identified SI theory as one of the theories. That's a micro-level analysis that tries to focus on small groups and how people create meaning out of the exchanges of symbols in different situations. What's another one of the 3 main sociological theories, Jamie? Functionalism is correct. Is that a macro or micro level analysis, Karin? Macro is correct. Okay. So what's kind of the analogy that you'll see for functionalism a lot, Wayne? Yeah, like a body, human organism, or a machine. Good. And then the last of the 3 main theories, Derek? Conflict theory. Is that macro or micro? Hannah? Macro. And then what's the key point of conflict theory? Like, what do they focus on? JJ? Okay. Yeah, inequality, power, status, stuff like that, okay? Good. All right. So let's get into the chapter specifically. In talking about chapter 6, when we look at sexuality, what are some observations that the text made about sexuality in terms of changes over time? Have attitudes, practices, behaviors of sexuality changed over time, or have they stayed pretty much the same? They've changed. Okay, in what ways? Give us some examples.
I mean, I guess like homosexuality is more like common nowadays. It's more accepted, I guess.
Okay, so norms regarding what sexual behavior is acceptable have changed. You could say that for sure. Good. What are some other examples besides same-sex relationships that have changed? Let's say last 100 years in the United States.
Well, I guess like even like I think we use this in class. Like a female swimming suit was like layers, and now it's like just bikini. You know?
Okay. So what's considered sexually provocative has changed over time, or appropriate. Good. What else? So we've got same-sex attractions, behavior, and level of exposure. And then what else? Okay, premarital sexual activity, cohabitation, and that of course is it more common or less common? More common. Okay, good. So again, if you could identify some of those trends and apply those, that would help you also. Some of the terminology that we talked about was just a variety of different terms that have sexual as the root word. Terms such as bisexual, transsexual, heterosexual, asexual, intersexual, etc. So be able to apply those in many different situations. Okay. So if I were to say in this chapter, sometimes I use examples from the class, but I steered clear of that for this chapter for obvious reasons. But if I were to say like, I don't know, Bill, we don't have a Bill, do we? Okay. If I were to say that Bill is like attracted to his roommate and his roommate's girlfriend, then Bill would be considered what? And you would say bisexual, right? Makes sense? So there'll be a few application questions like that in the test as well. All right? Okay. Another thing that it talks about a lot is like functions of norms regarding sexual activity, whether that is monogamy or whether that is different types of norms that are mores, that are strong violations of norms. So what is one of the cultural universals when it comes to a more regarding sexual activity? Give me one example. Okay, incest is a prime example. Could you define that next?
Sexual relationships, direct blood relatives.
Okay, sexual relationships with direct blood relatives. All right. So why does that exist from a functional standpoint? Why does that exist from a functional standpoint?
Procreation with close relatives reduces the chance of genetic mutations of our cool.
Okay. So functionalists would say that taboo exists because, in part, it wants to discourage the chance of genetic mutations. Good. Anybody else?
I don't really.
Well, let's stick with the incest taboo example first. Okay. What's another function of the incest taboo? How else does that help society to function? Max said decreasing the chances of genetic abnormalities in children. What's another example? Let's put it this way. If you guys are in high school, obviously you're aware of situations where there have been people that have dated and then they broke up, and then there was like a friend that came in and started dating the other person, and that led to some tension, right? So now let's imagine for a second that the incest taboo was gone and that was just considered acceptable. What would be a latent function of that? Yep, exactly. Right, so the incest taboo in part helps family ties to stay stronger, because if that didn't exist, there could be distrust and even more conflict amongst people that are in family relationships. Okay? All right, I think again, a lot of these questions, you just kind of have to think through. As long as you understand like functionalism, conflict theory, you can figure out what some of the functions of different norms are. Okay? All right, one of the studies in the text talked about people that identify themselves as mostly homosexual. Do you remember what the statistics on that were? Like, what was the percentage? Was it fairly high or fairly low? Okay, so when you say fairly low, like how low? Okay, 2.8 was 1. Was that for men or women? Men, and then women was about half that. Another major thing that we talked about in class was pornography and prostitution, both of those, right? Pornography and prostitution. One of the researchers argued that pornography and prostitution were in effect functional for society, that they actually serve some important functions. What were some of those functions?
It eliminated wasn't it like STDs?
Okay, would that be pornography or prostitution?
Prostitution.
Prostitution, obviously. Okay, so somebody could argue that pornography helps the function of limiting the spread of disease. Okay, what else? Okay, what's a critique of, let's say, pornography?
It encourages premarital.
Okay, anything else? Okay, objectification of women. What else? Some people also argue that it encourages violence against women. Remember the study, the Wilcox study that I mentioned in class? He's a professor in Virginia, and like if you get to be a college professors usually pick an issue and then they focus on that and they just research that like for their whole life pretty much. So his like focus is on pornography and the effects that it has on society. And one of the things, remember he talked about like the 4 trends that all pornography pretty much has in it. And one of those trends was that it encourages violence like through the depiction. Like there are guys in the films that if they wanted sex, they had to push the woman around a little bit and then they could get it, right? So there were four of those that were listed in the notes. If you look at those, that might help you to understand some of the questions, okay? You aren't asked to, there's no listing in this section, obviously, but that part probably would help you a little bit, okay? Okay, remember we talked about manifest and latent functions? What's one latent function of prostitution? Okay, it could be. Yep. Okay, infidelity. Okay, look that up when you get a chance also. There's a question about that. All right. One of the big themes that we've had in this whole unit was nature versus nurture, right? Nature versus nurture. If something is hypothesized as being due to natural causes, what do they mean when they say that? Yeah, it's genetic or it's biologically based, okay? If it's due to nurture, what do they mean when they say that?
Environment.
Yeah, it's environment or it's socialized, like somehow you're taught that, okay? So if somebody were to say that crimes are committed mostly because of biological factors, what would they say? Like what's an argument in favor of that?
That doesn't want necessarily look like
Okay. Anybody else?
it's possible they can be treated like any other disease.
Okay, it's possible they could be treated. Now, how about the other side, the nurture side? What are some arguments in favor of that?
It's like who they hung out with. That's nothing.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, now let's look at some of the weaknesses now. let's look at psychological versus sociological theories of deviance. In a psychological theory of deviance, what's the explanation? What's the focus? What's the focus stated simply?
Brain.
Yeah, what's going on in somebody's mind? Okay. So, what's a weakness of that approach then?
We don't know that much about the brain. Yeah.
Okay, brain's pretty complex, so it's hard to explain stuff. What else?
It's much more difficult to do this experiment.
Okay, it's difficult to test. Like, how many people in the U.S. commit crimes? Are there quite a few crimes that are committed? Like, of any type? All right. So, is that always correlated to people having some psychological abnormality? No, not always, right? So another weakness could be that psychological factors don't fully explain criminal activity because a lot of the people that commit crimes, either previous to that or even after that, do not show any factors that are abnormal. Okay. But there has been some research on that, but it's just we don't fully understand it yet, right? Okay, think back to chapter 7 also. Merton has something in the text that he called strain theory. There's a box in chapter 7 that's related to that. I actually had you guys draw a picture of that in your notes in class, if you remember. It's page number 180, okay? So you might get a couple of questions on the test where it asks you basically to apply some of those scenarios. So let's look at this review session, what we're doing right now. If you really want to get a good grade, so you are coming to this review session, which one of the boxes would you fit into, according to Merton's strain theory? You accept the goal of getting a good grade, so that'd be the conventional goal, and you accept the means by coming to a review session and studying. What would that be? Conformity. Okay? If you just kind of tag along here because your friend is coming, but you really don't care about the grade too much, what would that be? You're like going through the motions. No? Ritualism. Yeah, because you're still doing what other people do, but you don't really care about it too much, okay? What if you, I'm trying to think. What if you want to get a good grade, but instead of actually studying, you like come in and threaten me somehow? That'd be considered innovation. Yeah, give me a good grade or I'll beat you up or something. I don't know. Okay. All right. And if you like don't care, don't do anything at all, what would that be? Retreatism. Okay, good. If you like drop out of school and go live in a forest somewhere and grow your own food and grow a beard, what would that be? Rebellion. Okay, makes sense. So could you, if you see some scenarios of that, could you apply it? A few questions on that. Okay, if you live in a caste system, what is the main determiner of your social position? Birth. If you live in a pure meritocracy, what's the determining factor of your social position?
Your effort.
Yeah, achievement, merit. Good. If you're in a class system, what is it? A little bit of both. Okay. What are some arguments as to why class system keeps some caste qualities?
It's still something to do with your birth. It makes it more difficult for some people to enter the meritocracy conditions.
Okay, so that's kind of a conflict analysis. People that have power want to keep some of that power for their family so they don't totally make it a meritocracy. Good. What else? One of the concepts we talked about also was social mobility. social mobility. Briefly stated, what does that mean? Social mobility, what does that mean? Okay, a change in status. So it could be going up, could be going down. So some CEO that gets caught like embezzling stuff. What was the guy's name? Yeah, Bernard Madoff. So he's in prison now, lost everything he had. He went down, obviously. Okay? Somebody that wins the lottery, works really hard, becomes a CEO of a company, they go up, okay? If somebody changes position, like their parents were pretty poor, and then they're wealthy, what is that called? Intergenerational social mobility. Then what if they themselves change? Like they start out rich and then become poor. Intragenerational. Okay, so their parents were wealthy, they were wealthy, and then they go down. That would be an example of intragenerational. Okay, how about status consistency? Excuse me. What does that mean?
Stay the same. Stay the same, so keep the same status.
A little bit louder, I'm sorry.
Keep the same, like don't change.
Not necessarily. A little bit more. Status consistency. Remember, Faber talked about socioeconomic status. When you talk about status, it's not just money, it's also prestige and power, right? Mm-hmm. So status consistency would be somebody that has roughly equal levels of all three of those things, okay? So if you look at like some dude that runs the drug cartel in Los Angeles, whoever that is, that's in charge of like making drugs transfer across the border, he probably has a lot of power, right? If he wants to kill somebody, probably can get it done in the area. Probably makes a lot of money, but he doesn't have a lot of prestige because most people in the U.S. would say he's extremely deviant and they just soon have him dead. So would he have high status consistency or low status consistency? Low status consistency, okay? How about like a pastor? Typical pastors have MDivs or doctorates, so they have a ton of training, but they don't make that much money, but they have a lot of respect. So what would they have? Low, right? Low status consistency because it doesn't match up, right? If everything matches up, if they're all like high or they're all low, then it would be called high status consistency, okay? So be able to identify some of that if you're doing some examples. All right, we talked about high income, low income, and middle income countries. So there's some questions about that in terms of can you identify countries that are in those categories? What type of poverty is there? Remember we talked about absolute and relative poverty. How many people live in those categories, etc. So if we look at the world, the highest 40 nations would be called high-income countries. Most of those are found in the northern hemisphere, and most of those are also found in either Western Europe or the Western Hemisphere. So some examples, give me some examples of some high-income nations. USA. What else? Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Norway, Japan, etc. Okay. Middle-income nations, many of those are found where? What two continents? Asia and South America. Good. And then most, not all nations in Asia are low or middle income, right? So you look at Japan would be high income. Same thing in South America. There are some that are high, some that are low. Most low-income nations are found where? In Africa. Okay. In terms of overall world population, where do most people live? High, middle, or low? Middle. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you just remember, China and India are both what? Middle. Those two countries alone. Yeah, that's 30-40% of the world's population, so that helps out.
Which is next after that?
Huh?
What's next after that?
High, middle, low?
Yeah. Like middle, and then low, and then high.
What do you mean? What's
Like in order?
Oh, in population? I don't remember offhand. And if I don't remember, that tells you what. Probably not going to be on the test. Yeah. So, I don't know. I would guess, I would probably say high would be next, just because a lot of the European countries, although there's not any like massive ones, they're all like 50 million people about. So, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay. One of the researchers that did research about gender was Margaret Mead. You remember Margaret Mead? She was looking at male and female roles in societies. And in her study of societies in New Guinea, what did she find?
They had matriarch, the women's.
Yep. I can't remember for sure if she said that it was a matriarchal society, but I would guess that it was because the traditional roles were reversed. So like the men were like more passive, submissive, emotional, whereas the women were more assertive, more aggressive, more demanding. So that would suggest that if they were more assertive, that it was a matriarchal society, but I don't remember if they stated that specifically. Okay?
What who did that study?
Margaret Mead. Another guy that did research regarding gender was a guy named George Murdoch. I'll check the page number on that. If you look on page 278 is where it talks about Murdoch's study, okay? So the key focus of his research was that was on the effect of technological development on male and female relationships. So if it was a pre-industrial society or if it was a post-industrial society. So in pre-industrial societies, was it more likely that there would be clearly differentiated gender roles or less likely? Try again. It was less likely. Okay, it really depended on the society. Whereas in post-industrial societies, it was more likely that there would be clearly defined roles. And he has a couple different hypotheses behind that. Part of it was because they're so focused on survival that they just kind of all had to chip in. So if you read more into his research, he talks about how like just sheer calories that people would eat, women would gather more calories than men actually. Their work was more valued in those societies, whereas in post-industrial societies it's not as much. Okay, there are two other researchers that talked about gender. We'll probably end up talking about this tomorrow. One of them was Carol Gilligan. If you've taken psychology, you remember we talked about her. Gilligan focused specifically on morals, like how boys and girls see what's right and wrong. And what did she find?
Boys are more concerned with what's right and wrong. Boys are more focused on rules, and girls are more about feelings and exceptions.
Yeah, exactly. So boys were much more concerned about the rules and would identify like injustices as somebody violating the rules, whereas girls were more concerned about team unity and feelings. So if somebody's feelings were hurt, they were more likely to identify that as an injustice. Okay, so Lever talked about games for children, boys and girls. Which gender do you think preferred games that had clear winners and losers? Boys or girls? Boys, yeah. And one of the theories of the book is because of that moral reasoning, right? Boys are focused more on the rules, girls are focused more on
What
the...
was that man's name?
It was a lady, actually, Janet Lever. Yep, Lever. In the text, we also talked about 5 different types of slavery. If you can't pay somebody back, like you have a loan and you can't pay them back, and you have to work for them for like little or no pay, what type of slavery is that? It's in the name, it's pretty straightforward. That's debt bondage. Okay, if you actually own somebody else, what type of slavery is that? Chattel slavery. Yep. if you're in a country where it's extremely patriarchal and you're in a marriage where you can't really get out and the man's controlling everything, what would that be? That'd be a servile form of marriage, okay? So like I said, make sure you can identify some examples of high income, middle income, low income countries. In the US as a whole, where are some of the poorest places to live? There's kind of three general areas that are poor in the United States. What would those areas be? Where? More specific than the South? No? Southwest, okay, like border communities. What else? Okay, old inner city areas, so Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, okay? And then what else? One more. There's been a lot of stories about this in North Dakota recently. It was in the forum today, maybe yesterday. No? We have quite a few of these in North Dakota.
Small towns.
Yeah, reservations. Yeah. So the story in this instance was about children on the reservations and some of the problems that they have there. So that the headline was, child born addicted to meth returned to her mother. If anybody saw that in the forum. Okay. All right. When we talked about global stratification, there were two main theories that they talked about. Modernization theory, and what's the other theory called? Dependency theory. Okay? Modernization theory basically holds that there's two problems in why poor countries are still poor. What are those two problems? Cultural beliefs and technology. Okay? Dependency theory, when they explain poverty, what are the problems?
Exploiting the one country.
Rich nations exploiting the other nations. So they set up the economies in a way that basically keeps the poor nations poor at the benefit of the wealthy nations. Okay. One of the other theories we talked about in regards to stratification was in chapter 8 was the Davis-Moore thesis. Davis-Moore thesis. I'm going to go off the camera for a second and get a refill. I'll skip and dry. What does the Davis-Moore thesis say?
Deviance or social stratification as a function.
Okay. So Davis-Moore thesis holds that stratification is it functional or dysfunctional? It's functional. Why? Why, according to the Davis-Moore thesis, is stratification functional?
You need like a working class. Basically, for society to run, for that to be massive. So there are different classes to do those.
Okay, it's basically applying capitalism to functionalism, in essence. So Davis-Moore thesis would say you need enough rewards in place to draw talented individuals to positions that are considered functional in society. So shortly stated, the Davis-Moore thesis would say the greater functional importance a position has in society, the more functional rewards society attaches to it. Okay? So sometimes those rewards are more than just money. It could be other things, like power, for example. Okay? So there's actually a section on the test where it gives you, there's 6 questions, where it gives you statements, and you have to pick the quote that agrees the most with the Davis-Moore thesis. So if you understand the Davis-Moore thesis, it's a functional analysis. If you just remember that first, that the Davis-Moore thesis is functionalist, okay? If you remember that first, that'll help you to eliminate some of the statements. So if you see something that talks about like how people interpret situations, what theory is that in general? That's SI, so throw that out, right? It's going to be something else, okay? If it talks about how everybody should have everything equally, What is that? Conflict theory. So throw that out also for that section, right? So apply stuff to functionalism, basically. Okay? So there'll be, like I said, there's 6 questions about that. So does everybody understand the Davis-Moore thesis? You could read quotes and apply it. Okay. What's the key difference between income and wealth? Income and wealth.
Does it have anything to do with wealth being like universal or not relative, and then income being kind of relative?
No, not necessarily.
Wealth can be like property and stuff too, whereas income is like strictly monetary wages or.
Right. Income is wages, wealth is property, whatever. So let's say that I have a long lost relative that I don't know about that dies and then leaves me for whatever reason. I'm like the next of kin. It's like Mr. Deeds, but Fargo. And he leaves me like 4,000 acres worth of mineral rights in the center of the Bakken, the oil development in Williston right now, okay? At that point, I'd have a lot of wealth, but I'm still teaching, so I don't have a lot of income. Make sense? Now, as those get developed, if I were to quit teaching and go do stuff with that, then my income could rise. But in that instance, the wealth and income wouldn't match, okay? Okay. Let's see. When Weber talked about social stratification, he identified something called socioeconomic status. What are the 3 parts to that again?